Hello and good morning. My name is Sanje Ratnavale, and I'm the president of OESIS. While we're waiting for our attendees to join, let me give you a quick introduction and then we can get going. Today we are talking about the need for planning and strategy to balance what's going on the programmatic side. There's been a great series of articles written by our guests today. And let me start by introducing them. We have joining us today Josh Freedman, who is the co-founder and president of 6 Seconds. We also have joining us today Michael Eatman, who is a 6 Seconds preferred partner and a DEI specialist, very well known on the independent school world. And we also have joining us today Dennis Biscard. And Dennis Biscard is a head of school, has been a head of school at a number of schools across the country, is the current head of school at Northwest School, is very well known in the DEI world. And with that, let me just get started and let me share my screen. Welcome, Josh. Welcome, Dennis. Can you hear us, Dennis?
Yep, thank you.
Brilliant. So I'm going to share my screen and show you, first of all, the article. This is Intrepid Ed News. If any of you haven't seen Intrepid Ed News, we update this daily with articles across our network and also across other networks. This is the article, I think, that we're looking at. You can go into the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion collection, and there you will see a series of articles on DEI. And today we're discussing Quadrant 1, which is part of a graphic that Josh very kindly put in his series of articles. And in Quadrant 1, we're really talking about the emphasis on planning. Josh, why don't I start this off by letting you really explain to us this graphic that you started your series with, and telling us a little bit about the conundrum that schools and organizations have. I know that you are working with over 200 organizations across the world, there's 6 Seconds, in terms of helping to build culture, and cultural change often fails for all kinds of reasons. Why don't you give us a little bit of a context on this graphic first?
Thank you, Sanjay, and hi, Dennis and Michael and everyone. When we, Michael and I have been in conversations with a lot of people leading DEI efforts and wanting to have DEI efforts implemented in their organizations and in their schools. And in particularly over the last few months, as we all know, this has accelerated dramatically, thankfully. We started to look at the different ways that we saw DEI officers and organizational and educational leaders talking about this. And frankly, Sanjay, I was a little bit baffled. I'm much newer to the really focus on DEI compared to Michael and Dennis. But I was a little bit baffled because we kept having conversations with people who had real depth of experience. And they would say, you know, this is the way. And somebody else would say, no, this is the way. And I mean, of course, this is a very complex area. But what I realized in conversation with Michael is there are a lot of different perspectives here. And we set this graphic out as a way to try to think about and organize some of the differences. And so, for example, there's some people that we would talk to who would say, you have to teach the vocabulary. If people don't have this vocabulary, you cannot do DEI. It's not DEI if you don't define anti-racism. And then other people who would say, you know what, that vocabulary is not really relevant. We really have to do something else. We have to do something about how we feel and how we are holding each other. And the vocabulary actually is in the way. And then we would have a conversation with somebody else who'd say, look, we've got to get into action today. This is urgent. The house is burning. And somebody else would say, look, this has been going on for hundreds of years. If we try to go into action today, we're just going to recreate the same old thing. And so what I just walked you through were the 4 poles of this graphic, that on the right-hand side, like, let's really focus on the explicit and the visible. On the left-hand side, let's focus on the internal. On the bottom, let's focus on the now and what has to happen. And on the top, let's focus on the long term. And so we structured this model. This is a model that we've had for a very long time, thinking about organizational culture and school culture. But we started to use it as a way to think about these different perspectives. Michael,
Josh, just define for us, what do you mean really by explicit and implicit?
Visible, invisible.
And so you're talking about the nature of how people have absorbed the needs for relationships. You're talking about on the implicit side, you're talking about on the explicit side, you're talking about practices, policies, assessments, curriculum. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
Michael,
so curriculum is a great example. Curriculum is explicit. The attitudes and approaches that people have internally as they use that curriculum is implicit.
Right. Michael, why don't you pitch in here?
Certainly. Well, it's certainly good to be online with all the folks who are here. Dennis says it's so good to see you, Josh, Lynn, and Sanje. As I was listening to Josh, thinking about, my work has been primarily centered as a diversity officer, and now I'm as an executive coach, just thinking about if we operate in the programming realm alone, which I've experienced many diversity officers operate in, there's good programming across many, many schools. However, if those programmers are limited to only that sector, there's a vision piece that is left out, and there's an analysis piece that is left out. And I think too often diversity officers are not a part of the strategy, and for a number of reasons. Maybe they don't have the skill set, or there's not the level of trust in the organization to include them in that. And so as Josh and I have been talking, I really think the model is evolving to really have who are the people that need to be in the room, what are the skill sets that need to be developed in everyone, not just the person coming into the room, because it's one thing to be brought into the room, but the room has to be able to have the capacity to support you. So just thinking about the strategy and programming, the implicit and explicit is really an important conversation that many of us need to have.
Right. So Dennis, let me pose a slightly difficult question to you. You've been involved with all kinds of schools who've had DEI work being taken on for years. But just like these 4 quadrants, they've tended to be siloed. And silos, including these 4 quadrants, really don't work because you don't necessarily you can't easily just go from one to another in a nice, clean process. Comment on that, would you? And tell me what this chart tells you.
Sure. When I first saw Joshua's article and chart, I actually appreciated when people take something very complicated and try to make it simple, right? And I think oftentimes the visual and the 4 quadrants was very, very helpful to me. I think it illustrates actually that it's impossible to be a diversity practitioner because you're not likely to have strengths in all 4 quadrants, right? Which means you really have to have a team approach. And I'm thinking about, yes, you want a system thinker, you want an EQ champion, you want a wordsmith, an analytic, and you want somebody who can execute a fantastic program that's meaningful and impactful, right? And I do think oftentimes we tend to find ourselves go back and forth in these quadrants. And again, if you have strength in 2 of them, the 2 other ones are going to suffer. So I very much appreciated the approach. I think what it also tells us is you really have to have a systematic approach, right? It has to be institutional. It can't be driven by individuals. And one thing I often like to think about is whoever is the diversity practitioner, the diversity team, you have to be very, very grounded, be able to hold multiple truths, suspend judgment at a time. Because if you still are on your own identity formation process or journey, things are going to fall apart. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Josh, so let's go back. Today we're focusing on quadrant 1. We're going to try and keep these webinars short to 30 minutes. So please get ready with your questions, all of you who are there. And let's focus on quadrant 1. So quadrant 1 is looking at strategy, right? What are the key elements here and what tends to be missed?
Well, I mean, Michael can actually speak to this better than me.
Okay.
We've had a lot of conversations where we've heard people saying, let's focus on let's get into action. Let's focus on quadrant 4. And what I hear Michael doing as an executive coach and somebody who is, as I say, much more steeped in this than me, what I hear him doing is really elegantly saying to leaders, yeah, you're right, let's get into action. Just before we do that, where is this going? How are we going to know that we're moving forward in the way that's going to make the real difference that you want to make? Michael sometimes says, well, let's I want to just check in before we start on that plan. How aligned are the board members and the head of school and the other people, and what are you aligned around? And so Michael asks these kinds of questions that move people into quadrant 1. And Michael, I've just heard you do this many times, so I'm getting used to it, that this, like, trying to link. And really what we're trying to do is link all 4 quadrants. But if we don't have quadrant 1, something bad happens.
Yeah. I'll just jump in for a second, Josh. Thanks. It tells that we're working together. I truly believe that the strategy is really important, because many diversity officers are passionate about the work. I believe it's more than passion, because it's really institutional design. And so when we think about institutional design, you have to, you don't just build a house. If you try, you'll see quickly that it doesn't stand. And so the strategy piece, when we talk about schools focusing on strategy and metrics, well, how do we want to measure, what our organizational change will look like? Who are the people that need to be there? And one of the key ways, Sanje and others on the call, is having this strategy plan. And of course, for many people, strategy plans are Achilles heels. Do we do one for 1 year, 3 years? But the alignment piece for me is always telling. How aligned are the board of trustees and head of school and leadership team around connecting cultural competence to the mission? When that is vacant, there is usually major challenges.
Can I ask a question? I want to push ourselves, like the team here, right? Because oftentimes you hear about culture eats strategy for lunch, right? So the one issue I had with the quadrant a little bit is, like, where exactly do you start? Because a lot of our institutions would be flawed. So even whatever strategy you come up with initially may not be the strongest foundation just yet, right? So I agree with you, Michael, but I'm just wondering where to start. And I guess it depends on where institutions are in the first place.
I'm going to take a little crack at that one, since, if you don't mind, and then I'll pass that on to Josh. I think it's, you obviously have to start with the mission, but there's often a problem with the mission. And the problem with the mission is that it tends to be either too institutional. So we are a school that is a college prep school that, et cetera, or it's has a lot of what is needed, but it hasn't defined a set of outcomes. Independent schools, or schools in general, have avoided having outcomes, but they have the competencies and skills that they want for their students. And, they've had a very successful past and will have a very successful future. I think for me, what we need to do is go back to the mission and draw from those pieces what the competencies are, not just for the students, but for the teachers and for the community at large. And so you'll see words like kindness and compassion and communication and all kinds of stuff. Now, in the past, those pieces have not been assessed, right? And the other thing that they haven't had is a kind of opportunity map. And I've been talking about this for some time. I mean, if you look at what we've been doing as schools for the last 100 years, we've been doing curriculum maps. And really what we need to do is start to do opportunity maps. And opportunity maps are really looking at how students get to discover and practice whatever it is that we think is important. So I'll pass that on to you now, Josh.
Well, in 2 weeks, we're going to come back to culture eats strategy for lunch, because I think I mean, this is absolutely right. If we just stay in quadrant one, we're stuffed. And I think that there's another problem here in quadrant one, which is I'm increasingly aware that as a white man, I have a certain set of lenses in the world. And that set of lenses, I mean, all of us, we all have a set of lenses that are fogged, if you will, by the society in which we live, by the systems in which we operate. And so one of the problems for quadrant one is we say, well, let's make a plan, but we are embedded in a racist, sexist society. We're embedded in a society that has, I mean, I think we'll always have biases, but we're embedded in a society where those biases have been allowed to be very destructive. And so as a result, that plan is flawed. And I think one of the key things here is that's okay. Our job is not to make the right plan. Our job is to make enough of a plan that we can then move to quadrant 2, then 3, then 4, and then back to 1. And to keep going around and around this process and say, you know what, the plan, I know this plan is wrong. That's okay. I know this plan is flawed. That's okay. We're going to get what we can get. We're going to get started and we're going to iterate it very soon and not think about this like some kind of like holy grail of plan that's going to be the right plan.
Great. Josh, can you take a look at the question thread? For some reason, I don't seem to be able to access it. We will take your questions now. We've got about 10 minutes left. But while we're waiting for some questions, I think there's one in the chat already.
Yeah, let me give this to Michael. What is the role of focus groups / climate surveys in quadrant 1? What metrics have been most effective for schools? And before I pass it to Michael, I just want to say that the word climate is really tricky here because even Michael and I, a lot of us use the word climate to mean different things. And so we just have to be a little precise when we say, so I'm just gonna take Matt's question without the word climate and say, Michael, what's the role of focus groups and surveys in quadrant 1?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. I think focus groups are really important with the provision that you know why you want the focus group. And so when I think about a climate or organizational inclusion assessment, what we're attempting to do is to get a sense of what is happening in the organization, not racially. What we're trying to get a sense of what's happening in the organization and how it works. What are the systems? What are the forms of communication? What are the disconnects? And so what I found is the ones that I've been seeing very effective are ones that adopt a framework along with the focus group. So whatever the focus group questions are, they're connecting to the framework. So when you're taking your data and analyzing it, you can see where it connects to the framework. I've seen a lot of people do great focus groups, but there's nothing to measure it with. So you just have a lot of really good data. And for me, that feels cumbersome because it doesn't allow me to go, well, what do I do with this data now? The work that I've been doing through my training has really connected to a cultural competence framework that helps us look at the inclusion gaps and also the inclusion successes. And when I say inclusion, lastly, it's not racial, but what is the institution? What are the needs around diversity? So those are the ones that I found to be effective, ones that connect to a framework.
Dennis, what if you were going to put something on your dashboard as a school leader and obviously as a very well-respected strategist in this space, what's the data you want to see as a school leader?
You know, I'm not sure I'm the strategist. That's why I surround myself with systems thinkers. But you know, one measure, and I'm not sure how exactly to measure it, but I always find in the schools I work at, I try to envision a culture where people feel that they're part of the very fabric of the school, right? So, and I like the whole notion about coming to the table, the hardness table, right? Sometimes you're a leader, sometimes you're a follower, but you make sure that the voiceless and the introvert, that they also have a voice at the table, and how do you manage that? So how exactly to measure it, I will leave up to the researcher.
Well, people have been measuring communication skills, right? We measure communication skills as an overall umbrella, Dennis, right? In all the stuff that we do. The competency frameworks that measure communication skills do it a little bit differently, in the sense that they're using explicit performance indicators by age level and breaking it out, right? And there are certain competencies that, you know, are easier or more adaptive to that kind of approach. Wouldn't that be an important kind of criteria for us to be able to see, you know, how are we now communicating in classes as a community with ourselves as parents, et cetera, et cetera?
So I think there's two things there, Sanjay. One is competencies and cultural competence, emotional intelligence, communication skills, our awareness, our self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Those competencies are going to be foundational tools.
Mm-hmm.
The outcome of using those competencies
Mm-hmm.
is going to be trust,
Yeah,
belonging.
yeah.
Michael's brother does this at a university level, and Dr. Tim Eatman talks about, Michael, you can say it better than me, this piece about, do I feel like I'm
Full participant.
a full participant?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'll click on that really quickly. We talk about double clicking, this notion of belonging. And
Mhm.
if we don't communicate, if you ask me, Michael, if I'm in a different tier in the organization, you go, Michael, how are you feeling? The possibility of me telling you the truth without relationship is very slim. But if we create an environment where I know my head, let's say Dennis is the head of school where I work, and I know that Dennis is continually invested in me, I know when tough times come, there's an environment where I can tell him the truth. I think we see that with people of color, we see that with women, we see that with folks who are part of the LGBT community. Too often in the C-suite, we haven't had a strategy around how do we communicate, because we have siloed thinking in the beginning. So that's an area that really needs some attention around how do we communicate, and what are you hearing when I'm communicating with you?
And ultimately, we are schools, right, where learning takes place. So the performance has to show up in learning, right? Otherwise, you know, what exactly are we trying to do, right?
And I would say that notion of learning as a strategic imperative. I was talking to a head of school about this last week, and she was telling me that there's a kind of cultural norm in a lot of institutions that you're supposed to know already. You're supposed to have the answer. A lot of us have a myth of leadership, which is around, you know, the tall, proud leader who's decisive, and I know the answer. And in a way, that's antithetical to a message of, no, I'm here to learn. And I think there's a tremendous amount of courage required to be a learner and a leader.
Sanjay, I know we're going to end in just a moment. I just hope, as folks are listening in, one of the things around the strategic impetus is that we also think about a strategy for faculty and staff. I believe that schools create strategies for students, and it's very strong. And the folks who I think are most anemic in the building are faculty and staff, because they get a salary and they have benefits, which are important, but there's an emotional belonging piece that really has to be a part of a strategic mandate as we think about this work.
Well, I mean, this is probably what's come out most in the last 12 months. You know, we've been having this conversation about how you can teach emotional intelligence when you don't have emotional intelligence, or you haven't been taught emotional intelligence. My wife tells me that all the time. And
I'm not alone.
Dennis, any comments on that?
Your wife is right.
I will say sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
No, you know, it is interesting. You know, you have what they call the soft skills, right? But they're just so important. What I often look at in an institution is you have leadership that has nothing to do with hierarchy, or positions, right? And to tap into that, because I think that there are connectors, there are folks who have that Velcro who can really tie a community together. And I think oftentimes we don't tap into that kind of capacity that you actually have within the institution. So I may not have the EQ, but I go at it. You know, if somebody else can do it, that's who should do it.
Brilliant.
So I want to just say one thing about this, Sanjay, which is, I think, again, as a white man and as a CEO, I have been afraid to stand up and say, yes, I'm going to be a leader in this space of DEI. And my first impulse whenever I've needed to respond to something or send an email or propose a plan around DEI, my first impulse has been to go to somebody who's a BIPOC member of 6 Seconds community and to say, okay, what should I do? And actually, Michael and I are working on a program on coaching equity and how, as coaches, we step into this space of equity. And one of the things that's been fascinating to me is that all of us in the faculty in this program and most of the participants in this program, irrespective of their level of DEI expertise, irrespective of their racial identity, has said a similar thing, which is, I'm working to find my voice in this space. And that was kind of shocking. Like when Michael said that to me, I'm like, what? You've been doing this for 20 years and you're a Black man. Like, how do you not already feel like you have a voice in this space? But it turns out it's complicated.
Yeah.
And so I would say part of Quadrant 1 for us as leaders really brings us to Quadrant 2. But who is going to lead? Who is going to stand up and say, hey, folks, we got to make a plan?
Yeah. I think
and that's not about skin color.
You use the word lane, right? In that context, if I remember right, which is that's what you were talking about, right, Michael?
Yeah, and we can both, the thing is, I think the theme as we're coming around the corner with this conversation today is that we can all drive, but you have to have the person who is the key leader to have the capacity to go, it's okay if I'm not good at everything. And then to model that, but too often we're not modeling that. And even in this conversation, each of us has a different perspective. They don't need to compete to be relevant. And I think that's a soft skill and a hard skill that we get to teach and get to explore as we work with schools.
Well, I think that's a great segue into what we're going to discuss next week. I think it's next week in the next Quadrant 2. Do you want to give us a quick flavor of this before we cut this off, Josh, Michael?
I think, well, go ahead, Josh. Oh, you're on mute, Josh.
You're muted, Josh.
I started to say that the Quadrant 2 is more internal, right? But Quadrant 3 is also internal. Quadrant 3 is about myself and the individual skills. Quadrant 2 is very much about the relational context, the culture that we establish, the trust that we're going to build to have the conversation. So we can start with Quadrant 1 and say, this is the plan. Now, are we going to listen to each other?
Yeah.
At a board level, at a senior leadership team, is the senior leadership team going to have an honest conversation about what we're proposing from Quadrant 1? My guess is no. My guess is no. Somebody's going to say, here's the plan. And people can go, oh, okay, yeah, sure. That makes sense. But they're not going to be enough trust to really get honest the first time around. We're going to have to go around this horn a bunch of times before we really get that implicit conditions for the long-term conversation.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Josh. And we'll be back with Quadrant 2 in a week or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Right.
Take care.
Take care, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis.